Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined again by Dr. Kostas Kampourakis, and we're going to talk about his new book, Trusting Science: Why We Need to Reconsider School Science Teaching. And I'm also leaving links to our first two interviews in the description of this one. So, Dr. Kampourakis, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure for me too to talk to you and discuss about the books.
Great. So, why did you feel the need to write such a book now?
Yeah, well, as you know, during the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion and questions regarding what scientists can really know and how valid the recommendations about the various measures that we're making were. And I started wondering, why is this happening? Knowing that, of course, there is a lot of uncertainty inherent in science, but at the same time, the reactions of people were sometimes extreme. So I decided to look into this and try to understand what might be the cause of this issue. There are several important ones, but in this book I'm focusing on what I think is an underexplored question: how much people really understand about science.
Right. And we're certainly going to get into the COVID-19 pandemic later in our conversation. But more generally, how do you look at the current state of science communication and public trust in science?
On the one hand, scientists are among the most trusted professionals, along with medical doctors. This is what several polls show, with politicians and journalists being at the other end. At the same time, it's not that everyone trusts scientists. Polls show percentages around 60, 70%. So there is an important portion of people who are not ready to trust. And this is something that should make us wonder why this is the case. In relative terms, there is trust, but in absolute terms, there are still people who are wondering if they should trust scientists. This brings us to science communication, which I think is not effective, in part because scientists are not actively involved. The experts, the real experts, are not actively involved. And, and another part because whenever they do that, it's not as effective as it should have been. Now, the point I'm making is that we should not blame scientists, we should not blame the public, but we should look into the educational systems and ask the question: have we really prepared students to become thoughtful citizens who can ask the right questions about science and who are ready to understand what science is about? And I'm sorry to say that the answer is more or less no.
Right. But what do you mean by trust in science? What is trust exactly?
Yes, trust in general is to be confident that someone can do and will do what you expect them to do. In other words, when we trust someone, we believe that that person is willing and able to do what we expect them to do. And this brings us to two important questions. The first one is whether scientists are able to understand nature and advise us when this is relevant. And the second is when they will do that. And of course, in the vast majority of cases, the answer is positive in both, because overall the scientific communities that have the expertise on specific issues are able to give us recommendations, or at least they are the best ones to give us recommendations, because of course there will always be things that we will not know. And on the other hand, we know that they have no reason not to be willing to help us. Having said that, there always exist, and there will always exist, and there have always existed scientists who are not that competent or who are not that good willing to help us, but this does not represent the majority. For the vast majority of cases, this works, and this is why we should trust them. But the big question is how we should be able to identify when and how to do this.
Why did you decide to focus on vaccination in the book? Of course, it's not the only topic you go through, but why such a focus on it?
Yeah. Well, there are two reasons for this. The first one is that during the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about vaccines, and this is a question that concerns every citizen. It's not, of course, the only one, or not even the only important one. Climate change is another, but it is something that has been bothering people forever. The other reason is that I'm teaching a course here in Geneva, and I'm giving classes on vaccination and the history of vaccination. And my endeavor in these stories made me realize that there's some issues that are not properly understood, even by my undergraduate biology students. And so the combination of this, the eternal questions about vaccines and my observations in what might be difficult to understand made me focus on that because, as I figured out in the end, if we look carefully at the history of vaccination, we can see what is that bothers people, what is that people do not like, and then this gives us insights about how to address it.
What happened during the COVID-19 pandemic that you think is illustrative of how the public reacts to scientific claims, at least nowadays?
Yeah. Well, the first important thing is that for some people, especially those of us who live in the Western world, it was something entirely new. People in Asia had experienced pandemics like this at a shorter scale, of course, in the past, but it was not that new for them. It was too new for us here in the Western world. The second is that the reaction was immediate, and there was so much funding used, transferred to the production of vaccines that we ended up having safe and efficient vaccines, as it was shown along the way, too early. And I'm saying too early in a negative sense because not everyone was prepared to accept this as a fact, to accept that the vaccines that were produced in less than a year could be safe first of all and then effective against the disease. Thankfully, that was the case. So all in all, we were in a very difficult and uncertain situation with measures that disturbed the life of many people. And then we were asked to get vaccines to have a medical intervention with products that were produced very, very fast, which of course causes concern to people. So I think that in the first year or so of the pandemic, these reactions were natural and normal because that was a new situation and things were changing very fast.
In regards to vaccination, for people to understand about it? I mean, how do vaccines work?
Well, the important thing for people to understand is that, simply put, with vaccines, we somehow simulate an infection. The difference is that whereas the first time that we will be infected, we may develop the disease, with vaccines, it's very unlikely to develop the disease. We may have some people may have some symptoms, but the important thing is that our immune system is prepared, and the first time it will encounter a pathogen, it will react as if it was the second. What we do, in other words, is that we make our immune system ready to produce the necessary cells so that it reacts efficiently and so that we avoid the disease.
And of course, during this pandemic, mRNA vaccines were produced. So, what should people know about these vaccines that were produced and administered during the COVID-19 pandemic?
That was a new technology, which also had its concerns, but it's one that works very well. In some cases, it is much more efficient than other methods. It's not the only one, of course, but it seemed to work very well and produce the necessary coverage and the necessary protection for our organism. mRNA is something that exists in all our cells. It's not something that we cannot find there. And it was just a specific procedure in the process of producing the necessary molecules that will make our immune system react and prepare for the future infection. There's nothing unnatural in all that.
Yes, I mean, one of the things I heard from some people who were worried about these vaccines back in the pandemic, like 3 or 4 years ago, was that they thought that because they were mRNA vaccines, they would be able to get into the genetic material in our cells. I mean, but does that make any sense?
No, this is not at all the case, exactly because the process of all this does not entail that these molecules will enter the nuclei where our DNA is found. In contrast, these stay outside the nuclei in what we call the cytoplasm, where the proteins that we need for protection to initiate the reaction of the immune system will produce. So I would say it is exactly the opposite. There are other kinds of vaccines that might require an integration of something inside the nucleus, but this is not what we have here.
Great. So, but what leads to vaccine distrust? Why do people develop this kind of distrust?
Yeah, I think there are two main reasons. The first one, it is a medical intervention that is against something that we do not see. So when people are sick, they will immediately get whatever their doctors recommend to get over the sickness, the disease that they're dealing with. In the case of vaccines, there's no disease yet. So we are asked to make a medical intervention against something that is not there. And this makes people uncomfortable. The other part is that in some cases, not very often, there are secondary effects of vaccines just because some people are more sensitive to these molecules or for other reasons. These are rare, but they do happen. So the combination of these two, the fact that we're asked to make a medical intervention against something that does not yet exist, and the fact that we listen people talking about side effects. Autism is not one of these, but there are secondary effects. Some people, to put it simply, react more than they should to the vaccine, as if it was the pathogen itself, makes us concerned. And so parents, for instance, are wondering, why vaccinate my healthy kid and insert inside my boy or my girl, something that comes from a pathogen. It is a normal reaction, I would say, for a sensitive parent, but it is not justified at all, because what we need to think about is not only the risk of having a secondary effect due to the vaccine, which is very low, but also the risk of dealing and dying from the disease, which is much higher in the case of infectious diseases.
So this is more of a, I guess, philosophical question, perhaps a political one as well. But is taking a vaccine a matter of individual liberty or of collective responsibility? Because, there are some people that when they were confronted with certain policies that were set in place to, in a way, force people to take the vaccine, they didn't like it, and they said that they should only take the vaccine if they wanted, that it was a matter of individual liberty. But I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it depends on the vaccine, and actually depends on the disease we're talking about. If we're talking about a disease like tetanus, where the pathogen is not transmitted from one person to the other, then it is entirely a matter of individual liberty. If people do not want to be exposed, they can have the vaccine. If they want to take the risk, they can. But in the case of infectious diseases, diseases where the pathogen is transmitted from one person to the other. It's no longer about individual liberty. It's also about collective responsibility, because we should feel responsible and take actions not to transmit pathogens, especially to vulnerable people. So, in other words, with the SARS-CoV-2, the vaccine, the virus that caused the pandemic, or with any other virus or bacterium that are transmitted from one person to another, the question of vaccination does not only concern our personal protection, but also the protection of others, especially people who are vulnerable, depending on the situation, usually very young or very old, or people who cannot be vaccinated because they have issues with their immune system.
So another example that you explore in the book has to do with abortion. In this particular case, explain how science can inform decisions but cannot alone support them.
Yeah. Well, this relates to the previous question you asked. Whether being vaccinated is a question of individual liberty or collective responsibility is an ethical question. It's not a scientific question. Science can tell us what happens, it can inform our decisions, but then it depends on our morals and ethics to decide how to deal with this. Similar is the case with abortion or the termination of pregnancy, as we can call it, because we cannot really define in absolute terms when life begins. So the two cells that fuse during fertilization, the sperm and the ovum, these are alive. And so they have functions. And so is the zygote, the fertilized egg that results from that. And so it is the blastocyst that implants on the mother's uterus and so on. However, we also know that there's so many fertilized eggs that are never implanted for whatever reason, and this is natural. So the fact that we have a bunch of cells that have the functions of life does not entail necessarily that we have an individual with rights. And this is again a decision that can be informed based on our knowledge from science, but cannot be made on the basis of scientific facts. It has to do with our values, it has to do with our morals, and perhaps our legal decisions, our legal perceptions of what is happening. So the issue here overall is that science in many times can inform our decisions, but we need to consider other aspects, our values above all, to decide what to do.
Mhm. Yes, so in this particular case of abortion, of course, apart from the fact that it's hard to tell exactly when life begins, another thing that people usually discuss and they are worried about or interested in is when exactly does uh, a person begin, or when does the fetus acquire personhood? And that's more of a philosophical than a scientific question, correct?
Exactly. The fact that we have living cells does not entail that we have a person there. And the decision about this bunch of cells is a person is an important one, but it's not a scientific question. It's something that we need other kinds of thinking in order to make a decision. And it's quite more subjective because, in different societies, different decisions are made.
Mhm. So, what are the aspects of how science works that you think are the most important for the public to understand?
There are many aspects of what we call nature science, what science is and what we do, that in my view, and that's the final recommendation in the book, should be taught to every future citizen. But for many reasons, this is not what we do. We tend to focus on content knowledge, which, in my experience as a former teacher and teacher educator, these are details that students will soon forget. Whereas we should try to educate them to understand the mentality, the habits of minds, and the processes that scientists follow when they do science. And I have a list of specific features of science in my book that are important to understand, which do not come from my normative philosophical analysis of what science is, but it comes from my analysis of the controversies. So I looked at specific controversies throughout the history of vaccination, and I figured out what people were asking about, and from this, what they could not understand. And just to be clear, I'm not blaming people for not understanding what they fail to understand, but I'm blaming the educational systems that did not prepare them to do this. To put it simply, if people cannot read, it's not themselves to blame, but the educational system that did not teach them how to read. In the same sense, if people do not understand science, we should go back and look at the educational systems and what they did in order to prepare them for this. And in my view, this is something that we do not do very well, or perhaps we do not do at all. And this is what the book is about, is a call about reconceptualizing, reconsidering what we do in schools.
And what constitutes evidence in science? How is evidence established?
Well, what scientists are looking for are data, which are facts, information, observation that can be found out there. Now, this becomes evidence under a specific theoretical framework or theoretical lens, philosophical sometimes framework, and the interpretations may differ. The important point for science is that whatever the case, we cannot make conclusions and we cannot explain anything if we don't have data which we have analyzed and interpreted, and in that sense, that becomes evidence for or against a conclusion. Now, the problem, as I explained in the book, is that sometimes we do not have the evidence we want to have because we cannot have it or because we have not yet found it. And this is what causes misunderstandings because lay people sometimes think that scientists can answer all questions or that they can have all the necessary evidence, but this is not the case. So what we need to do is to explain to them what kinds of data we're looking for, how they become evidence in specific contexts, and what kinds of inferences we can make from this. Unfortunately, we cannot have all that we need and we cannot understand all that we want, and that's a natural part of science.
So, how should people deal with uncertainty in science and with the fact that knowledge in science keeps changing and getting updated all the time? Because I think this is a crucial aspect of how science works that people fail to have a proper grasp of, and then possibly also leads to them distrusting science.
Well, we have to learn to live with that. We have to accept it. And unfortunately, sometimes the way science is portrayed in the public sphere gives a sense of, absolute knowledge, definitive knowledge. And there are people who use the word science or scientific to describe something as authoritative, as certain. And of course, there are many things we are certain about, but there are also things that we do not know because uncertainty is inherent in science. And as we explained with a colleague in another book about uncertainty, it actually makes science advance because the more we do not know, the more questions we ask, and the more we end up understanding. This is something that is not easy to accept, but whether we like it or not, science can offer the best possible answers to our scientific questions, but there will always be things that we will not know.
So, to illustrate uncertainty, tell us about it in the specific case of medicine and how the practice of medicine is based on calculated risk.
Yes. We have epidemiological studies. We can tell us a lot about how often we find one or the other disease, or even one or the other factor that causes a disease, exposure to chemicals or, sites on DNA associated with diseases. And from that, we can estimate how likely it is for any person to develop one or the other disease, given their life habits, given their family history, and everything about this. But there is no way that we can absolutely predict what would happen to one or the other individual. And this is when some people get frustrated because, we may say that a disease is very rare, but when it happens to a person, it's 100% for them. And that's difficult to deal with. So a big issue is to make the distinction between the statistics, the epidemiological data, and what happens to each individual. And we need to understand that we can make inferences from the former about the latter, but we cannot be certain. The other thing has to do with the medical interventions, and I use the concept of calculated risk in the story of polio because when they made the clinical trials in the 50s, they knew that there might be problems. They were not entirely certain about the vaccine, but at the same time, the parents were so concerned about protecting their children. And I have to note that polio was not the most deadly disease, but it affected children and it left them sometimes with difficult problems to deal with, that they decided to take the risk and vaccinate them in order to refrain from having the disease. And in that case, they estimated that things might or might not go wrong, and they decided to take the risk. And because the protocol they followed at the time was very, very good, and they followed it carefully, there were practically no problems. Unfortunately, when the government took over the vaccine production on a larger scale, things did not go very well, and there were people who developed disease because of the vaccine. So the notion of calculated risk is that we can estimate up to a point, and sometimes very, very with a smaller margin of error, what could happen, but we can never be 100% sure.
So you just told us about the example of polio. Tell us also about uncertainty and risk in the case of cancer. How do doctors and medical researchers deal with uncertainty and risk in cancer?
Yeah. First of all, cancer is not one disease. It's a collection of diseases that have some similar features, but
Yes.
depending on the organs that are affected, treatment, interventions, prediction can be very different. So what we know in general is that people that have a family history of cancer are more likely to develop it and should be more careful. And this is not necessarily hereditary because there are families that may be exposed to the same factor in their environment and develop cancer because of that. The point is that family history can give us a good sense to be on alert and try to help people avoid that. But of course, there are people who develop cancer without having any family history, and this has to do with the specific environments and the specific exposures that they had, and most importantly, with the fact that we do not really know what is the cause of cancer. Sometimes they say that there are mutations, but in recent years, we have come to understand that the mutations are not the cause, are perhaps the effect of problems in cellular interactions. So all in all, because in most cases we do not really know the exact cause, even though there are cancers that are due to specific mutations that we have identified, we cannot really do much except recommending clinical examinations, clinical exams at particular ages in order to avoid this as much as possible.
Why is it important for people to trust the experts, and to what extent should they trust them?
It is important because the experts are those who know. And it is important to note that any scientist can be an expert in very, very few domains and not in anything about science. So even though I wrote a book about vaccines and trust in science, I'm not an expert in vaccines, and I'm not the one to consult when a person has a question about vaccines. There are experts in vaccinology, pediatricians who have worked on that for years, and they are the ones to consider. And of course, these people have no expertise in climate science, for which we have other people who are working on that. So, all in all, what we need to do is to be able to identify who are these people who really know what they're talking about. And luckily, this is something that can be done because for each topic, there are specific communities, scientific communities of experts who have a collective knowledge about a topic, and this is who we should trust. Not individual scientists, but the scientific community related to a topic as a whole and their collective knowledge. Because all of them together, they filter the evidence that is there, they discuss, and they arrive at conclusions, which I think we should trust because this is the best knowledge we can have.
Right. But when it comes to identifying the experts people should trust, how can lay people determine who are the real experts when it comes to particular claims?
Well, this is not really easy to do, but people at least should be aware that in each domain there are people that have studies and have experience and have worked on specific topics for years and have publications and are respected from their peers. So, all in all, people could be able to identify who are the experts in each domain. And of course, the experts know one another and they can tell us that. But exactly because this is difficult to do, it is easier for lay people to trust the respective societies, the respective communities. So, for instance, if the American Cancer Society or the European Cancer Society or any other such society makes a statement about something, we should know that this comes from the consensus of the people involved in this society who are all experts. And this is what we should prioritize and not the view of an individual, even if that individual is an expert who has a different view.
But when experts disagree, which sometimes happen, who should people trust?
If it is about individuals, we should look at who these individuals are. But we should also see where these individuals belong. And for instance, if we have an individual that represents the consensus view, who represents a scientific community against someone who does not, then it is more rational to trust the person who represents the community and express the consensus view. Now, having said that, in the history of science, we have had many maverick scientists who opened new ways and changed what we know and how we understand it, because they had insights that the community did not have, and the community sometimes was very resistant. Of course, this is the case, but this is less likely to happen than the opposite. So, in the case that we have such a scientist who is a brilliant person and who sees what the community cannot see, we could look at, who this person is. Is that person really an expert? And what the others say about her views. For instance, if the views of that person have undergone peer review and are published in an acceptable venue, a journal, for instance, then we should carefully consider that. And there will be times when the scientific community for some time will not have made a definite decision, as it was the case during the pandemic. But in the end, there will be a consensus. We will arrive in a consensus. But this is less likely to happen, or at least it happens less often than the other way around.
In what circumstances should people hold a skeptic attitude towards certain scientific claims? I mean, when is it warranted?
First of all, being skeptical is a healthy attitude towards science, and it is healthy attitude among scientists. All scientists should be skeptical until they examine the relevant evidence and decide whether it stands or the claim stands or not. But when we see different claims, we should look at who is the expert. And when there's a new claim about something that we have not seen, then we should try to see what is the consensus view about that. So in the book, I have a diagram that guides people to think about this and make decisions, which I hope it will prove useful. It's not always easy, but there are specific elements that we should consider that more or less relate to the expertise of the person and how far that person is from the consensus view. This is a guide that can help us better understand what is happening.
But what is the difference between being reasonably skeptic of certain claims and being a science denier? Because I think that many times the difference is not very clear.
Yes,
Right.
science deniers are people, luckily very few, who make, of course, a lot of noise, who think that in principle scientists conspire to, hide the truth, not let us know what is happening. They have bad intentions and all that. Uh, there is not much we can do about these people. Of course, an interesting question to ask is, what would these people like to see in order to change their mind? But I'm more concerned about people who distrust science, people who do not know what to think about science because they cannot really handle what is happening. And this is what we should pay attention to. I'm the first to say that no one should blindly trust scientists. People should have the means to understand, as a colleague described things, to be informed outsiders and understand what is happening to the extent that they can. And here comes the responsibility of the experts and of the scientific communities to make things as clear as possible to lay people. Scientists have a real important responsibility to explain things to the public, in part because it is the public through taxes that funds research in many cases, but also they have a moral responsibility because if they do not do it, then someone else might and might take things to a different direction.
Mhm. So we've already talked about how certain questions have to deal more with philosophy than science. So let me ask you now, what is the relationship between science and policy?
There are specific disciplines in science that have an impact on policy decisions. Climate change, climate science is one, vaccine science is another. These are scientific domains that inform political decisions, what to do about emissions in the first case, whether or not to vaccinate people on the other. And this is where things get difficult. And nobody or almost no one worries about quantum mechanics or cell biology because these may not be perceived to have a direct impact on our everyday life. But when it comes to climate science or vaccines, for instance, these do have an impact and these do affect the decisions made. And this is where people mostly react to. People are mostly concerned about the scientific knowledge that has an impact on everyday life, and they are right to do so. And this is exactly the science, I call it in the book policy science, science related to policy, that we need, that the experts need to clearly explain to lay people.
But I mean, it's not the case that when it comes to policy, we can derive the proper policies that we should adopt directly from science or from science, or we can determine them from science alone, right?
No, this can never be the case because there are always other factors to consider. Let me give you an example. If during the first month of the pandemic for Europe, that was March 2020, all of us stayed inside our houses for 2 weeks, there would be no pandemic. But it was practically impossible for everyone to stay inside, and we know what happened next. So, scientists of course, recommending measures like, public distancing and things like that, masks and all these things, because we know that they can work, but the decisions made had to also consider, for instance, the economy or the mental health of people. And this is why different countries um, made different decisions about the measures they took, with different results that we can now analyze and understand. But there is no way that these decisions could have been made only on the basis of science, because science might say, yes, if we avoid contact, this will end. But people had to earn their living and people had to work and get the things they needed. So this was never that simple. And this could have never been a decision that scientists alone could have made. The politicians make these decisions and they have to consider different kinds of aspects, different kinds of factors. And this is what they did with more or less success depending on the country.
So tell us about the case of eugenics from the last century. Was its implementation based on any solid science and evidence?
Yeah. Well, this is an example where, political decisions can be made on science that is not solid. The sad fact is that until the late 1920s, most geneticists accepted the premises and the assumptions of eugenics, even though the evidence was not that strong. But for different reasons, people were convinced that we could improve our species, our societies with this. Along the way, they started to understand that this does not really work, and in the 30s, many started to react. But unfortunately, it was too late for the people who were sterilized in many countries, and this happened even after the Second World War until the 70s in some countries. And later on in Nazi Germany, with the extreme application of these measures to those who were considered unworthy of life. Um, in retrospect, we know that there was really no evidence, but at the time it was a problem, especially in the beginnings, that most scientists would agree that eugenics was something that we could rely on and that we could trust. And this, of course, poses a question. Well, here's a case where the community agreed, people might have trusted them, and look at the results. Well, this is the case, but it wasn't the case for too long, because at some point there were reactions that made most of them change their minds, within a decade or so. A decade, of course, is a lot, but then we should note that it's not only about the scientists themselves. Policy decisions were different in different countries. For instance, in Britain, there were never any eugenics policies about sterilization. They tried to isolate what the people they considered feeble-minded, and this is the country where it all began. But there were never sterilizations to the extent that they were made, for instance, in the United States. So once again, it is the political decisions that are important and not only the scientific view.
So we've already talked earlier about uncertainty, for example. More broadly, what are the limitations of science that people should keep in mind?
Well, science is a human activity. We, as humans, we're limited in many respects in our perception, in our understanding. So it has the limitations that any human activity can have. Of course, things change, the instruments we use improve, our understanding of nature improves, but we should not expect from science to give us definitive answers about everything. There are many topics that we understand and know very well, and they are unlikely to change, but there are also things that are under development where our knowledge is less certain. What lay people should keep in mind is that science gives the best rational answers to these questions. It is the best we can have, and we need to learn to live with that.
So, one final question then. What do you think should be taught in schools about science to improve the ways people think about and deal with scientific claims?
All these that we have been discussing for the last 45 minutes, all these aspects of science, all these features of science that are not discussed, so that students, as future citizens, end up having reasonable and rational expectations from the scientific communities. Students should be taught how to figure out who is the expert. They should understand that skepticism, healthy skepticism, is very natural to have in science. They need to understand that science relies on solid knowledge that comes out from independent testing and different approaches to the same question, and that in the end, it is the consensus view of the community that we should trust more than anything else.
Great. So the book is again Trusting Science, Why We Need to Reconsider School Science Teaching. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Kampourakis, just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell us where people can find your work on the internet?
Yes, I have a personal page with based on the name is based on my surname, Kampourakis.com, where all the information about my books and my work is available.
Great. So thank you so much for coming on the show again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure for me too.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.